From time to time, I get approached by landlords who have occupied residential rental property that they are looking to sell. And I've realized that there are some things that they're not aware of as they're beginning to pursue this sale. So here is a brief presentation to talk about some of the things that every landlord should know if they're thinking of putting their property on the market for sale. The thing I find that surprises landlords the most is the fact that the lease survives the sale. A lot of times my landlords think that if they sell the property, that voids the lease, they give the tenant notice, they move out, and then they sell the property and close, and we move on with business as usual. That is not the case. The lease, based on Florida statute, survives the sale. And so what that means is the buyer of the property is bound by the terms of the lease. The goal of this is to make sure that the tenant is protected. If they have a lease that has 6 months remaining, they have the right to be able to remain in the property and have their lease honored for the duration of the time left on the lease. This is going to be a huge determinant in how flexible you as a landlord can be when you're looking to sell the property. Again, most of the landlords that I share this information with are surprised because they think that a sale voids the lease, but that is not the case. The lease always survives the sale of the property, and the terms of the lease will have to be honored. So let's look at what your options are. Your options as a landlord are going to be determined based on the type of arrangement that you have in place. Some landlords have a lease with a fixed term, 9 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever the term is, that is fixed in the lease. And in those cases, that document, that lease term survives the sale of the property. In some cases, there are landlords who don't have a lease term. They have tenants on a month-to-month basis. A month-to-month situation is a lot easier to navigate when you're a landlord looking to sell, because you can give your tenant 15 days notice to terminate. It gives you a faster way to get to a vacant property. And then empty properties, typically, unless it's a multi-unit property that an investor is looking to buy based on performance, those typically tend to sell better. They have a broader buyer base appeal. And so if you are a landlord that has a single family or a duplex, a smaller residential unit that you're looking to sell, not as an investment, but as a property that maybe you would like to have appeal to potential owner occupants as well, you may want to consider, if possible, transition into a month-to-month. You would do that if your lease were coming up for expiration, and rather than renewing the lease for a fixed amount of time, you could discuss it with your client and transition them to month. However, if you are in a fixed term lease and the lease is not set to expire, you can't just transition your tenant to a month-to-month. The terms of the lease must be honored. So just keep that in mind. One of the things that the law requires is that tenants have to get reasonable notice when you're showing the property. So 12 to 24 hours notice is going to be required. You have to make a good faith effort to coordinate it with the tenant, and showings need to be during reasonable hours. So 7 o'clock in the morning would probably not be considered a reasonable time to schedule a showing, nor would 9 o'clock at night. So typically business hours, maybe a few of the early evening hours might work, but at the end of the day, if the property is tenant occupied, the showings have to be scheduled with the tenant. So the type of relationship that you have with your tenant is going to have a significant impact on how flexible or how cooperative they will be willing to be to help facilitate the showing of the property. One of the things that you can do to ensure cooperation with your tenant is to make sure that you communicate early. Don't let someone come to the door to knock, to look at the property for them to discover that you're selling. That typically leaves a very bad taste in the tenant's mouth. So you don't want to do that. Let them know in advance that you're considering selling. Maybe, who knows, they may be interested in seeing if they could be a candidate to purchase. They like it enough to rent it. Maybe they're interested in trying to see if homeownership could be a possibility for them. So let them know upfront so that they could have that option if they choose. You can offer them incentives. One of the things that we found to be particularly effective is if we provide some type of credit or some move-in assistance to offer them an incentive to either leave early or even just to accommodate showings. We know it's going to be inconvenient for you, Mr. Tenant, to show the property over the next several weeks. So the landlord has agreed to reduce your rent by $100 a month. In exchange for that, what we're asking for you to do is to keep the place as tidy as possible and where possible accommodate showings. That typically we've had really good results with that, so that's something that you may want to consider. Keep them informed if the transaction is progressing, if things are happening, if a buyer has been located and we're moving through the steps in the process. Again, they just want to know that they're informed. They don't want to get a minute's notice that they now are working with a new landlord if they're on a lease, or that they're going to be given notice shortly thereafter if they're on a month-to-month. So just make sure that you keep them informed as much as possible. It cuts down on their anxiety. It makes them more inclined to be cooperative with you. So always a good idea to keep them in the loop. And then just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Respect their privacy. Don't show up unannounced. Don't show up at weird hours of the day and night. Make sure that they have the opportunity to preserve their life and to continue doing what they need to do by respecting their privacy. That goes a long way to keeping the relationship intact. I cannot tell you how much damage a hostile tenant can do to a potential deal when they are motivated to. All kinds of stories can emerge. They can make it very difficult to show the property. You want to make sure that the relationship that you have with your tenant while you're trying to sell the property is as positive as possible, because trust me, it is worth it. Tenant occupied properties, that typically can have an impact on your market value. Tenant occupied properties often sell at a slight discount for a couple of reasons. One, generally speaking, they don't show as well as owner occupied properties. The tenant is not as invested in making sure that the property shows to its best advantage the way that an owner occupant is. So typically they don't show as well. They're harder to show, and in a tenant occupied situation, if the buyer is someone who is looking to move into the property on their own, they're going to take into consideration the fact that there could possibly be a delay to get the tenant out, or two, they're also going to be concerned about the condition of the property. Once a tenant moves out, will they have to do repairs and other concerns like that? So typically, if you have a tenant occupied property and it's going to be sold to an owner occupant, you can expect that there will be a slight discount. From the investor side, if you have a multifamily or a property that is an investment property for you and your ultimate buyer will be using it as an investment property as well, what will drive the market value is the rate that the property is rented at and how close that rent is to market value. If you have a property where you have a tenant that's locked in a lease, say they have another 9 months on the lease, but the rent on that lease is significantly below what market value should be, the investor is going to take that into consideration when they calculate what is a good offer price for them, so that they can make you an offer that is going to be financially viable for them. Another point to consider is that poor property presentation, when it's occupied, often ends up with reduced offers. So there are fewer offers, the property doesn't show as well. Again, this is one of the trade-offs of not having it be either vacant or owner occupied, because the tenant typically is just not as invested. So what are the steps? Before closing, we have to confirm the facts around the tenancy in writing. So the new buyer is going to want to know what the rent amount is, so that they'll have an expectation of what it is that they're going to be collecting every month for rent. There also needs to be some clarity around the security deposit. If the buyer moved in with a security deposit, that needs to be declared, because if the property is sold, the tenant will be approaching the new owner with the request to have their deposit refunded. And if that didn't transfer, that is going to create a problem. That is going to be considered to be a discount, the purchase price, if they have to come out of pocket with it. So security deposit, we have to have written confirmation that the balances that are being transferred actually align with what the tenants say that they paid. And typically what we get is the tenant signing off to say, yes, this is a security deposit that they made, so that there's no confusion as to what was received and what would be on the table when it's time for them to vacate. We also need clarity around the lease terms. Typically, we ask for copies of leases to be provided as a part of the estoppel process. That way we know when the lease is expiring, what the terms are, everything's in writing, and that gets transferred over, because remember, the lease survives the sale. So if the new buyer is going to be looking to enforce a lease, they at least need to have a copy of the lease to know what the terms are that they have taken on, so that they know what they're supposed to be doing as a part of their enforcement. And then last but not least, any outstanding claims, any disputes, anything that the tenant is going to assert as it relates to funds that may be owed. They did repairs on their own and it was agreed that it would be taken out of the rent, any that's different from the rent that's on the lease, any variation to the terms of the lease, anything that's outstanding, we need to make sure that we get clarity on that, we get it in writing, and the tenant confirms that is in fact what is agreed on, so that the new buyer doesn't have to come in and fight that battle. They have documentation, there was a meeting of the minds, and moving forward they just have to be responsible for any issues that occur after they took possession of the property. As far as the security deposit is concerned, that typically is reflected on the closing statement when you sell. So the deposit gets transferred from the seller to the buyer at closing, and again, that is typically documented on the closing statement. Written notice is required to be provided to the tenant to say who has their security deposit, and if it's in a bank account, where it's being held. All of the rules around the security deposit transfer are covered in the Florida statute, so it's important to make sure that you are clear on what that is. It's really important to make sure that we cross our T's and dot our I's when we are dealing with security deposit transfers, because again, the lease preserves the right of the tenants and it survives the sale. Option that a lot of landlords have used to get the property, to have the property be vacant ahead of sale, is they've offered cash for keys. They've given the buyer, the tenant, an incentive to get out of the property, and maybe they'll help them with moving costs, or they will help them with some other incentive, some other financial incentive to get them out of the property. Make sure that any agreements that are made, you get it in writing and it's signed, and that there's a clear vacate date and what the conditions of the vacation, I guess vacation is the wrong word, what the conditions of them leaving the property actually is. If the property is vacant, again, it typically will show better. It'll be more accessible so buyers can see it at different times. So make sure that when you're deciding whether or not to offer cash for keys, you take into consideration potential impact that it can have on what you get for the property, and see if that trade-off makes sense. And if it does, then that may be an option that's worth pursuing for you. Selling with the tenant in the property is legal. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with that. There's nothing that would prevent you from selling the property with the tenant in place. But you want to make sure that you have a strategy that aligns with what your current situation is. So say, for example, you have a property that you've owned for 20 years and the tenant who's been there has been there for 12 years. And so for the last few years, or during the life of the time that they've been there, they've been a great tenant, they pay on time all the time, they don't report a whole ton of repairs, they don't cause any problems, and so you've wanted to keep them, and so you've not really tried to keep pace with what's going on in the rental market. You've given them either a very small or no increase year over year, and so where you are right now is you have a property that's rented at way below market value. Putting that property on the market as an investment property, that's going to have an impact on your value. So that's something that you may want to consider. Does it make sense for me to offer this tenant some type of incentive to leave so that the property can be marketed as a potential investment property where the new buyer can rent it at market rate, which is significantly higher than what I'm getting for the property now. So keep that in mind. Another thing to consider is the lease investor friendly. So is it something where it's structured in such a way that the new landlord can pick it up, the value of the rent that is being collected is more or less in line with where the values are in the market? Because if that's the case, a new buyer may look favorably on that because they know they're picking up a property. They don't have to incur any expenses to place a tenant. They don't have to incur any expenses to get the property up to speed, and so that if they're going to be getting market rate, that would be a win. They start earning from day one. That could be very attractive to an investor if you have an investor buyer that's coming in. So you want to make sure that you know who you're targeting potentially. Some properties lean more towards investor purchasers than they do to owner occupants. So you want to have an idea who it is that you're targeting and whether or not, based on who you're targeting, does it make sense for the property to be vacant or not. Because again, depending on the instance, if you're going after an owner occupant for a single residential unit, the property being vacant may actually add value. It takes out a lot of the unknowns. It makes it easier to show. All of that will add value to a potential buyer, so it may be worth it to go through the steps to get the property vacant. If, however, the property is more of an investor leaning type property and you are at market, it may make sense to just keep the tenant there and market it as a turnkey investment property where the person who buys it is going to start making money from day one without any downtime, and that could have a positive impact on what you put the property out to the market at. If you are a landlord thinking of selling your residential rental property and not sure what your next steps should be, reach out to me for a complimentary, no obligation consultation where we can go over your options. The best way to schedule that is through my website at simplyaskSharon.com. Please remember to like the video if you found the information helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can be notified when new videos are released. Thank you so much for watching, and always remember, when you own property, you own possibility. See you next time.